Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where Dr. Judd is, but focus, focus, people. So at the end of class last time, he was taking you through one of the ways in which we kind of systematize the knowledge is you can put things into tables, and tables just help you kind of organize the thing that you're trying to learn. So for example, photosynthesis involves a number of different variables that you might want to think about in terms of, which plants you might expect to find in different kinds of environments. So you can think about water use efficiency, risk of photorespiration, light intensity at which photosynthesis saturates, and the optimal temperature for photosynthesis. And you can ask yourself, for each of these key variables, what do you expect the situation to be for C3 and C4 plants? Does C3 have high water use efficiency or low water use efficiency? Low, because it has to open its stomata up in order to get carbon dioxide in. It's constantly having to do that because it doesn't want oxygen combining with rubisco. It only wants carbon dioxide combining with rubisco. So it opens its stomata a lot. As a result, it loses a lot of water, so it has low water use efficiency. C4 does initial carbon capture using PEP carboxylase. It only interacts with carbon dioxide, so it can let its carbon dioxide levels fall to really low levels because it doesn't interact with oxygen. And as a result, it can keep its stomata open or closed for longer periods of time. And when it does open the stomata, it can open them very quickly and close them again because that concentration differential between carbon dioxide outside the leaf and inside the leaf is very steep. So diffusion will happen really fast. Risk of photorespiration. This is related to the last one. Somebody other than Caden. Yeah, Sonia. Yep, for the exact reasons that we talked about, water use efficiency, C3 is more prone to photorespiration because it has to open its stomata open more often, but if it's going to try and avoid losing water, then it risks adding oxygen to RUBP because it uses rubisco. C4 doesn't have that problem because it uses PEP carboxylase for initial carbon capture. Light intensity at which photosynthesis saturates, somebody other than those two. Does photosynthesis saturate at low light intensity or high light intensity for C3 plants? Low, yeah. So it saturates at low light intensity, and C4 plants can continue to photosynthesize at much higher photon flux density, the number of photons getting to it. Optimal temperature for photosynthesis for C3 plants? Lower, cooler temperatures. C4 plants are better in warmer temperatures. Problem with having a goatee and a mask is sometimes your goatee gets in your mouth, and it's just disgusting. So whenever you can, think of ways of organizing the information in ways that are useful to you, and it'll make it easier to learn that information, hopefully. The last slide that he didn't get to last time, we don't really talk about CAM plants because CAM plants are usually desert plants and we're not studying desert ecosystems. But the vast majority of plant species are C3 plants. A small amount of total plant species diversity is C4 plants. But then we have all these CAM plants that are things like cacti. And they're similar to C4 plants in that they have a separation between initial carbon capture and the production of glucose. But in C4 plants, it's a physical separation in that carbon capture occurs in the mesophyll cells and the Calvin cycle occurs in the bundle sheath cells. But in CAM plants, it's a temporal separation instead of a structural separation in that initial carbon capture is done during the nighttime and the Calvin cycle runs during the daytime. And so it's similar to C4, except instead of a physical separation, it's actually due to temporal separation. Yeah, Sonia, you have a question? I don't know that anybody knows why they prefer C4 plants. Um, yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't know if they don't know or if they know and I just am unaware of it. But I've never seen anything put out there that would explain that. In theory, you might think that something like bison would like nitrogen-fixing plants, like lead plant or indigo plant or something like that, simply because it's higher in protein and it would be good for bison to get protein. But for whatever reason, they do prefer worm season grasses for some reason. And I'm not sure what that is. All right. Any questions about photosynthesis? Yep, that's the wrong one. Let me get transitioned out of here. All right. I want to talk to you guys for just a minute about models. So we've exposed you guys to a number of different kinds of models. Some of the models that we've exposed you to are mathematical models. This would include models like the population growth models, the competition models, where you can actually work through the model, solve for equilibria and things like that. So we've taught you about mathematical models, but we're also teaching you about conceptual models. When I use the term conceptual model, I mean that we're teaching you about ideas, and these ideas are ideas that you can structure your knowledge around. So competition is both a mathematical model, but it's also this idea that you can kind of structure your knowledge of interspecific interactions around. And we tend to stress these kind of conceptual models in this class more so than a lot of detail. I'm going to describe two methods of learning, and I want you to raise your hand after I describe them as to whether this was the way you learned in high school. When you were in high school, were you presented with a bunch of facts, you had to memorize those facts and then regurgitate those facts back onto an exam? Okay. How many of you in high school were given a conceptual model and you had to understand, for example, how a particular thing worked or how a system functioned, and then within that kind of larger concept, you kind of hung the details of that system onto that generalized framework? Did you guys learn that way? Okay, raise your hand if you learned that way. Okay. So the analogy that I have for this is that in high school, whoa, something's wrong. In high school, what you got was you got a bunch of leaves. They taught you facts. You picked up facts along the way. You kept picking up more and more facts. And over time, the shape of the tree kind of reveals itself from the pattern of the leaves. And so the idea in high school is if we feed students enough facts, eventually the structure of the tree will emerge and become apparent to you. This is the way I was taught in high school. This is the way I was taught in college. The problem with that is you have to be really good at integrating information in order for that tree to ultimately emerge. And if you're not capable of doing that, well, then you just don't have any place in science. Was kind of the view. What we try and do in this class, and we try and do this in the major as a whole, is we try to expose you to the tree. What's the shape of the trunk? How do the branches branch off? What's the conceptual underpinnings that underpin biology? We teach evolution and ecology. Within evolution, natural selection is one of these big ideas that kind of underpins a lot of biology. Within ecology, population growth is one of these bigger ideas that kind of underpins ecology. Competition is a big idea. Today we're going to be talking about nutrient cycling. Well, we can think of nutrient cycling as one of these big conceptual ideas that we can then use to apply to carbon cycling or nitrogen cycling or phosphorus cycling or sulfur cycling or potassium or anything else within this general framework. Once we've given you this general framework, then you have a place to categorize and organize all the little facts that are important to know, but you use the big structure in science to then give yourself a place to hang the details, and hopefully in the process of doing this, you can more easily retain and reproduce those details because you have this larger structural framework on which to build. One of the reasons some of you are struggling in this class is because if you're used to learning things one way from high school, you come into this class, we're asking you to learn things in a different way. It's going to take you some time to adjust, and we recognize that, which is why exams aren't the only way that we grade you. It makes up less than half of your overall grade in this class. So I think some of you were surprised at your grades on exam 2. They weren't as good as we hoped they were. But once again, don't get overly wrapped up in that particular score, because fewer than half of the points in the course are due to exams. What you need to do is think about ways in which you can organize the stuff that we're trying to get you to learn so that you can more easily assimilate it and then more easily reproduce it. Whether you're reproducing that in a literature summary or whether you're reproducing that on an exam, it doesn't matter. If you can find these ways of systematizing your knowledge, you're going to do better. Speaking of literature summaries, I have your literature summaries. We'll hand those back towards the end of class. I've written comments on them, in some cases extensive comments. They were generally pretty good. I was pretty happy with them. In a general sense, there are some of you who need work. If you need work, come and see Dr. Judd or myself, and we will help you through those processes. Some people need work at kind of basic writing mechanics, creating complete sentences, avoiding sentence fragments, and things like that. Some of you are still struggling with the science. We have a literature summary that is due next Monday on the VNetL paper. So use the feedback on these to help you write the next thing. It is next Monday, right? Yeah, okay. All right, good. Hopefully you've been reading it already. A number of you have come by to talk to Dr. Judd and myself about it. But if you haven't started reading it, you definitely need to start reading it now. Questions?
If you didn't get certain things back yet, like for example, you didn't get your test back last week,
okay. Yep. And if your lit summary is not in this pile, you didn't turn it into Dr. Judd the day that they were due, and so there isn't a grade. And I was a little surprised at the number of lit summaries that I didn't have to grade, which is a little worrying to me as well. All right. So before we get into nutrient cycling, once again, going back to this general idea, when we think about prairie grasses and forbs of the day and things like this, one of the ways that we can take these details and systematize knowledge is we can look at Panicum virgatum, which is switchgrass, and we can say, okay, well, what's one of the things that we can kind of hang this information on? Well, this is a C4 grass. This is one of those grasses that likes warm, dry areas. It puts up with really high photon flux density, has high water use efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. It's also obvious that this is a plant species that is found in drier areas, has very, very deep roots so that it can get full access to water as it percolates through the soil. It reproduces through rhizomes, just like we've seen a number of the plant species that we've looked at in the prairie also reproduce through rhizomes. It's a pretty adaptable grass. You can grow it under a lot of different conditions. And as a result of this, there are some people who are trying to develop switchgrass for biofuel, using it as a source for energy for fermenting and distilling into bioethanol, essentially. It's very tall, and it has this, it's called a panicle, isn't it? It has this really huge panicle, this really bushy panicle at the top of the grass head, which is...
Many of the grasses we've seen so far have spikes, like Androphoba has 3 spikes. When it's big and branchy like this, which you'll recognize when you see it again, like that.
Yeah, and you don't need to know it, but in case you're interested, it's spelled panicle. Yeah, Panicum virgatum, yeah. The prairie forb of the day is purple prairie clover. I haven't checked. You haven't done these species yet, have you?
No, I don't think
Okay,
so.
all right,
That
cool.
seems pretty easy.
All right. So this is a clover is a legume. It's a nitrogen fixing plant. Um, it's a perennial herb, so it comes back year after year after year. Um, Lots of times people use it in restoration, and one of the reasons people use it in restoration is because if you have a disturbed area, one of the things that happens when a plot of land gets disturbed is it loses its nutrient capacity, nutrient holding capacity of the soil. And so as a nitrogen fixing plant, this is one of those plants that will restore that nitrogen content in the soil. And so that's what it's really useful for. It also tends to like hanging out in disturbed areas. So you see this a lot in old fields as well as in prairies. And it says up here that it was used for Native Americans. I'm not exactly sure what they used it for. Do you recall, Nathan?
Yeah, but a lot of legumes have different medicinal things.
There aren't any notes on this particular slide, strangely enough. The prairie animal of the day, once again, I'm going small on you. So you might remember, I think it was the third prairie animal of the day was the grasshopper. And at the time that I was talking about the grasshopper species, I mentioned that one of the things about the grasshopper species is it responds to predation by moving to different parts of the prairie. Well, this is the predator that preys upon that grasshopper. And it's been shown that these guys, when they're abundant in the prairie, grasshoppers will actually move to a different part of the prairie, and as a result, the plants in the part of the prairie where there are a lot of the spiders actually undergo or are subjected to less herbivory from grasshoppers. And so this little spider, which isn't particularly big, can actually have effects on the distribution of herbivores such that it changes the distribution of the disturbance. So they're not particularly big. This species has brushes on the front legs, and the spider uses the brushes to wave the brushes at females, trying to get females to come and mate with them. A lot of work has been done on the mating behavior of these species. They also make noises with their pedipalps, their male copulatory structures. They can have a lot of offspring that are very, very tiny, and this is one of those species that you see that carries an egg sac attached to its back end during the parts of the year when it is going through reproduction. Females carrying egg sacs, but this is that brush. What's that? Nasty. Okay. Prairie plants and animals of the day. Questions? All right. We're continuing to try and understand Kanza prairie and kind of how Kanza prairie works. So I did this a couple of years ago because I was working with a student in my office, and this just kind of came out of a discussion of Veen et al. And so I just wanted to show you this so you can kind of put all of this stuff in perspective. So when we think about Kanza prairie being a prairie, we can think about climate being one of the primary drivers of why Kanza prairie is a prairie rather than a forest or a tundra or something else. Climate is just simply temperature and rainfall over long periods of time. And this temperature and rainfall regime affects how much above ground biomass there is, how much plant matter is above the ground. There's also below ground biomass as well, but when we think about the types of disturbance that we're thinking about, that affects above ground biomass way more than it affects below ground biomass. So we can think about temperature and rainfall affecting the growth of plants, leading to the growth of above ground biomass, but then these disturbances come along. Grazing and fire affect above ground biomass, but grazing and fire affect above ground biomass in different ways. Grazing decreases the biomass, but it's very selective because bison don't eat all plants equally often. So grazing decreases biomass, but it's selective, whereas fire decreases biomass, but it's unselective. It burns everything that's kind of there to be burnt. And so they both decrease biomass, but they do it in different ways. Grazing also alters nutrient availability, but when grazing alters nutrient availability, that usually leads to localized increases in nutrient availability. Whereas when fire alters nutrient availability, it oftentimes results in the loss of nutrients because those nutrients get volatilized and they just literally go up in smoke. So these things then feed back on the amount of above ground biomass that is there. Because you have more nutrient availability, you have more opportunity for plants to grow. You have less nutrient availability, you have less opportunity for plants to grow. And then, of course, the other thing that both fire and grazing do when you get decreased biomass is that alters the light environment such that when grazing comes through, when a grazer comes through and grazes down the plants, you have more light reaching the soil, so you have higher light availability. When a fire burns through an area, it kills all the old biomass, which once again means that you have higher light availability. So this is a good way of thinking about how Kanza works that I hope will help you understand kind of what Veen et al. Are trying to study. And so that's the other purpose for this thing being here. It's a good way of kind of thinking about Kanza as an integrated system. Now, we studied a lot about the details of how climate is determined back at the very beginning of the case study. We've talked about how above ground biomass gets built up because we spent time talking about photosynthesis, the two types of photosynthesis, etc. Now we're going to be talking about nutrient availability and nutrient cycles. So the other thing is you can take each of the lectures that you've been in so far and you can kind of relate them to different parts of this kind of conceptual model. So we want to talk about why organisms need the nutrients that they need. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in chemistry here at the beginning. And then we want you to be able to recall and identify the pools and fluxes of the carbon and nitrogen cycle. If you don't know what a pool is and you don't know what a flux is, don't worry about it. You will by the end of today. There are inputs, outputs, and transformations of matter. So carbon can take the form of glucose. Carbon can take the form of calcium carbonate down in rocks. Carbon can take the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so as carbon moves through an ecosystem, it might just move from one organism to another organism as glucose, but it might also be metabolized in the form of glucose and then released to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. That represents a transformation, so we'll talk about those. Transformations in the carbon cycle are way easier to wrap your head around than transformations in the nitrogen cycle. In the nitrogen cycle, we're going to talk about a bunch of symbiotic relationships. Who can define for me what a symbiosis is? Garrett. Yeah. That's a type of symbiosis. That's mutualism. So that's a specific type of symbiosis. And it's the one that pops into everybody's head first thing out of the gate. Yeah.
Some sort of interaction between two.
Yeah, generally it's defined as a close interaction between two organisms. Now, mutualism is a close interaction between two organisms in which both species benefit from that relationship. What's another close association between two organisms where both species don't both benefit? One benefits and the other does not. Parasitism would be a good example. And so in that case, the parasite benefits and the host is negatively affected. But those are all symbioses. So don't confuse those two terms, this term symbiosis versus the term mutualism. In this case, these symbiotic relationships actually all happen to be mutualisms when we think about it from the standpoint of nutrient cycling. So you're on the right track. Just be a little careful about terminology. So one of these symbiotic relationships is with mycorrhizal fungi, and there are a couple of different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi that we want you to know about. So, where to begin? When we think about an organism is made up of a bunch of component chemical molecules. Sometimes we refer to these molecules as the four macromolecules, four classes of macromolecules that make up the bodies of organisms. What would those be? Yeah.
Proteins.
So proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. I'm going to just expand this to carbohydrates, which includes sugars, but also includes structural carbohydrates. What's the fourth one? Nucleic acids, yep. Okay, so who can tell me for proteins what atoms, what elements are actually used in making proteins? Helium, argon, selenium, hmm? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. 9 proteins.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought it was John. I thought it was John.
Sulfur. Okay. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and occasionally in a couple of the amino acids there's sulfur. What about lipids? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, what else?
Which one's John? One of them's John. One of them's John.
Phosphorus is in there. So you will find phosphorus and phospholipids, the cells that all the membranes that go around all of your cells, all the cells of everything, those are phospholipid molecules that make up those membranes. So there's a phosphate attached to that. What about carbohydrates?
Carbon.
Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's pretty much it. That's kind of by definition a carbohydrate. It's kind of the formula is in the name. What about nucleic acids? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, because one part of a nucleic acid is a ribose molecule or a deoxyribose molecule. What else do we have there? We have nitrogen in the nitrogenous bases that form the actual nitrogenous base sequence, which is the information content of DNA. And so those are nitrogen-based molecules. And then what else? We have phosphorus because remember that there's the sugar phosphate backbone. Okay? So when we think about the kinds of molecules that organisms need, we can think about them in terms of these 4 different classes of macromolecules, and as a result of that, we can think, well, what kinds of nutrient cycling do we need to think about? Well, it would be nice to know something about carbon cycling, about nitrogen cycling, about sulfur cycling, about phosphorus cycling. We're actually only going to expose you to 2 of these, one of the easiest ones and one of the hardest ones, carbon and nitrogen. If you ever need to know about phosphorus and sulfur, we can talk to you about that. But here are carbohydrates, general structure of a carbohydrate. This is a standard structure for a lipid. This is a phospholipid, where one of these chains has been replaced by a phosphate molecule. And these are amino acids that are bonded together with peptide bond up here. And then this is, of course, the structure of DNA. You have a phosphate bonded to a sugar, bonded to a phosphate, bonded to a sugar, and then these nitrogenous bases that are held together with hydrogen bonds that keep the 2 chains of DNA together. When we look at proteins in more detail, we see that the nitrogen is in the base structure of an amino acid. And so all amino acids look exactly the same. The only thing that changes is the side groups. And there are a couple of instances where these side groups have unusual things in them. So there's sulfur right here as a side group. There's sulfur right here as a side group. Is that all that is? Yeah, just sulfur in a couple of the side groups. These are your nitrogenous bases, the pyrimidines that are single ring structures, purines that are double ring structures, and you can once again see all these nitrogens scattered around in these ring structures. So this is ultimately the reason that we want to know something about nutrient cycling, is because these nutrients are necessary for organisms to kind of get by, make themselves. So as we think about the ecosystem, where do we see plant biomass? Did somebody just meow? I thought I heard a cat meow. Yeah, okay. Me and Sonia are hearing things. Okay, maybe it was a chair. Where do we find plant biomass? Where in an ecosystem, sorry, I should have been clear. Where in an ecosystem do we find plant biomass? So we find it on the surface of the soil, growing up above the soil, so we have above ground biomass, but where else do we find plant biomass? Underground. So we have also below ground biomass in the form of roots. And in this case, I'm drawing what type of a plant in my crude drawing way? This is a grass. How do you know it's a grass? So it's got a fibrous or adventitious root system, and rather than being a branchy structure above it, it's more a bunch of individual stalks coming up. Dr. Judd just looked up to see if I was actually drawing. Oh. I thought he was looking. I thought he was checking. Is he really drawing a grass? Let me check that out. But we can think about this as existing at the soil-atmosphere interface. So above the soil, we have the atmosphere hanging out. That's where I'm going to find out how many of my pins are dead. And then we have this all resting on the soil. And so we can think about the ecosystem as having these two kind of major components, or compartments. There is a compartment of soil, and there is a compartment that is the atmosphere. And plants occupy both of these. A single plant will occupy both of these parts of the ecosystem. Now, where would we find animals? We would also find animals above ground, but we would also find animals below ground. But they're going to oftentimes be different kinds of animals. You won't find one animal that simultaneously occupies above ground and below ground areas. What you will generally find is animals that are on top of the ground, and then animals that live in soil.
Except for one prey organism of the day.
Except for one prey organism of the day, which is? Nope, that guy hangs out up in the grass. You guessed so. Thank you. Nope, once again up at the grass. Send the name there. These things are ecosystem engineers. Well, ants can be ecosystem engineers, but I wasn't thinking of them. Prairie dogs. Prairie dogs. Yep. So prairie dogs. I'll draw a little prairie dog because they're kind of chubby, with a little tail. And I'm a terrible artist, just so you know.
That's a cutie.
What's that? Groundhogs. Yep, but I don't. Dr. Judd, do groundhogs get over into the prairies?
Well, prairie dogs are squirrels too, right? Are they all in the same group?
I think they are. Okay. All right. Yeah. I also think of them as more eastern distributed. We're kind of on the edge here. We have a lot of groundhogs around here because we're kind of on this transition between the forested east and the grassy west. Plus, they also are another one of these species that does pretty well around humans as long as they can stay out of the road. So animals can occupy both places, but generally they're different kinds of animals and they are doing different things when they're on this landscape. Now, underneath soil, what do you find? This is a prominent feature at Kanza. If you dig down through the soil in Kanza, you get to this thing very quickly. That is one of the reasons that Kanza was never plowed up for agriculture. You get to rocks. Clay is just the nature of the soil at Kanza. It's going to be a clay-based soil. But once you get down past that soil, you get to rocks. Limestone in this case. So we also have what we refer to as bedrock. As rain falls on this ecosystem, I'll make this a coyote, except that I can't draw dog ears. Coyotes have kind of bushy tails, and they have long snouts with teeth. Now it looks just like a duck. Oh yeah, coyote ears. So this coyote is getting rained on. That's actually not a bad coyote for a stick coyote. When this ecosystem gets rained on, water percolates through the soil. As it percolates through the soil, what does it do to the nutrients that are in that soil? takes it away. Remember that water is a polar molecule. It has a partial negative and partial positive end. And as a result, it can latch on to the negative aspect of nitrate and the positive charge of phosphate. And as water percolates through the soil, it pulls nitrate and phosphate with it, negative charge and a positive charge. And when it gets to bedrock, what happens to this water? Can water flow through bedrock? No. So when it hits the bedrock, what does it have to do? It can either flow that way or that way. Eventually, at Conza, erosion has caused the soil to erode until you get down to a shelf of bedrock, and then there's a little shelf there, and then there will be another period of erosion down to another layer of bedrock with soil in between it. And so what you'll see is groundwater moving out to the sides, and when it rains, you'll see this groundwater seeping out of the cuts where erosion has exposed the bedrock. And then that water eventually goes where? Goes down the watershed into a stream. That stream flows into, ultimately at Conza, it flows into the Kansas River. The Kansas River goes through Manhattan, Kansas. Well, first it flows into Kings Creek, then Kings Creek flows into the Kansas River. The Kansas River joins the Missouri River right here in Kansas City at Caw Point. Once that water gets into the Missouri River, it joins the Mississippi River in St. Louis, and then that flows ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. So once water has carried nutrients out of the ecosystem in the form of stream flow, that stuff is lost. It's just gone bye-bye. It goes off into the ocean, and we never see it again. This is a generalized way of thinking about nutrient cycling. Interactions between nutrients that are in the atmosphere, in the biomass of plants and animals, and bacteria and fungi. I didn't even talk about bacteria down here in the soil. And then how it flows out of systems in the form of groundwater. So what we can do is we can think of soil as a pool. We can think of the atmosphere as another pool of resources, and we can think about how resources in the atmosphere get into plants and animals through fluxes. The movement of nutrients from one pool into another pool, because the biota, the living organisms, are also a pool where residents reside. So think about pools as kind of temporary static containers of nutrients. Fluxes are the movements of these nutrients from one pool to another. When a plant dies, it decomposes and transfers its nutrients from the biotic pool into the soil pool. There's also a groundwater pool, and at longer time periods, there's even the pool that is the bedrock. So this is how we're going to think about nutrient cycling. Any questions about that way of thinking? All right. So an ecosystem is all of the organisms in an area and all of the abiotic materials and energy with which they interact. So ecosystems are very large-scale divisions of the biological hierarchy. The only scale bigger is actually the whole biosphere, the entire world. And so pools, once again, are places where these nutrients are stored, and fluxes are the flows of these nutrients from one place to another, one pool to another. And cycles occur when you have nutrients moving from a pool to another pool and then back to that original pool, such that you might have material moving from the atmosphere down into the biota, and then the biota do things with that nutrient, and then they eject that nutrient back into the atmosphere. We can think about more complicated systems where you might have 5 different pools. In one case, flux 1 is a unidirectional flux from pool 1 to pool 2. Flux 2 is a unidirectional flux from pool 2 to pool 3, but between pool 3 and pool 4, there's actually a cycle going on before then it's ultimately lost from the system by flowing into pool 5. And then we can actually have larger pools that may have multiple pools inside of them. This would be the case with soil, and this is especially true with nitrogen. Soil nitrogen takes on lots of different forms. There are lots of different organisms that interact with nitrogen in the soil. So soil makes up this big pool, but within that big pool there are lots of subpools that are the movement of nitrogen from one type of organism to another. And that's actually one of the reasons that nitrogen is so complicated. So at this point, what is the nutrient cycle that you know the most about at this stage in this class? Oh, the water cycle. Okay, we're actually not going to talk about the water cycle at all. Sorry. I can't play to your strengths in this case. What's the next most, you know more about one we haven't even covered in this class. We just got finished talking about the basic components of one nutrient cycle. Okay, so photosynthesis involves which of the nutrients? Carbon. So we know about carbon. So one of the forms that it takes is carbon dioxide. What's another form that it takes? What's carbon dioxide right there? David, you gotta look at me. Gotcha. Glucose, okay. What's the formula for glucose? Okay. What's another really common form of carbon in rocks? In limestone is what I'm thinking of in particular. I don't know. What are you going to say? I can't know if it's right until you say it.
Because isn't there stored carbon in fossils?
Okay, so there's stored carbon. There's stored carbon in fossil fuels. Well, of course you did. But this is down in bedrock, in deep bedrock, like way deep, subjected to heat and pressure, taking all this dead organic material that used to be on the surface of the earth and converting it into fossil fuels once it gets buried deep enough. That wasn't what I was thinking of, but that's correct. And we'll actually talk about these later. See, you got to just spit it out there. It's probably right. You guys know what the main component of limestone is? You might not. It's rock. Thank you. Calcium carbonate. So, and there, as a matter of fact, there's probably more carbon in calcium carbonate than anywhere else in any of the other pools, but it's all locked up in rock. And so as a result, it doesn't really factor much into cycling because it's not really available to organisms for the most part. Do you know anything about the transformation of matter from carbon dioxide to glucose and back from glucose to carbon dioxide? What are those two processes? What does that begin to look like? That's a cycle, isn't it? Yeah, that's a cycle. So, who does photosynthesis? Plants. Where do we find plants? We find plants on the surface of soil. Draw my standard grass. We also find them underground in the soil. And we have carbon dioxide floating around in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide leaves the atmospheric pool to come to the biotic pool. And this flux is called photosynthesis. And that is not only a flux, it's a movement of carbon, but it's also a transformation because when it gets into the plant, it takes on a different form. What's that form? Glucose. So we're beginning to build a carbon cycle. I'm not going to tell you what the carbon cycle is. You're going to build it, and I'm going to write down what you say. Once glucose is captured in plants, where can it go? Well, give me a specific animal. Dugong.
Bison. Prairie dog.
That actually works. Prairie dog, let's say bison, since that's one of the major herbivores. I'm going to attempt to draw a bison. Stick figure of a bison has a big head with little horns, big hump on the back, and a little tail. Okay, thanks. I feel so much better now. So the bison is going to do what to the grass? It's going to eat the grass. So we have herbivory would be then the name of this flux. But is the grass changing forms as it goes from the grass to the bison? Yeah, the carbon is still in the form of glucose. So it ends up in the bison as glucose. And of course, we use glucose as organisms because we burn that up to fuel the function of our bodies. And that process is called metabolism, yes, but cellular respiration would be the more narrow definition that I was looking for. So cellular respiration is then another flux, and that takes the carbon that is in the glucose that is in the bison and takes it to the atmosphere in what form? CO2. It goes back to the atmosphere in the form of CO2. So once again, another flux, but once again, this flux is also a transformation. So we have a flux that is photosynthesis, which represents a transformation from CO2 to glucose. A flux that is herbivory, where there is no transformation, it's just the movement of glucose. And then we have another flux that also happens to be another transformation, which is the transformation of glucose to carbon dioxide. Are we done? No, we have lots to go through. What else happens in an ecosystem? Things die. Plants die. Animals die. And their carcasses hang around on the surface of the soil. But death is, once again, a flux of sorts. But once again, you're still talking about just glucose. But as soon as they die, what types of organisms start to work on them? Decomposers. So a lot of times we think about decomposition as happening in the soil. And decomposition is done by a lot of types of organisms. Can you guys tell me some decomposers that you think about? Yeah, so fungi. What else? Worms. I heard something different over here. Flies, certainly. I would think of birds as consumers more than they just are consumers that feed on dead stuff. I'm thinking more of the things that are going to take that glucose, break it down, and put it into the soil, which a bird will eventually do that, but a bird will do that by doing what? Pooping. So we could also have excretion. I'm so glad that you're enjoying my cartoon. But that actually involves phosphorus and nitrogen way more than carbon, so we don't really, it's kind of a negligible flux for the carbon cycle, but it'll become an important flux potentially for the nitrogen cycle. Yeah. Decomposition. When these decomposers work on the dead bodies of the plant and the bison, what are they doing? Is it just a flux of carbon such that it stays in the form of glucose, or is it actually transforming? Yeah, to what? What are these guys doing that these guys are also doing that transforms it? They're releasing CO2, but because they're doing what? They're doing cellular respiration. We've missed an important group of organisms that do the process of decomposition. Fungi, worms, flies, those are all specific examples. There's another big class of organisms that you're not thinking of. Bacteria, good. And as a matter of fact, of all of these, bacteria are probably the most important ones in soil. They're responsible for most of what is known as soil respiration. And it's called soil respiration because it's cellular respiration, but it's cellular respiration that goes on down in the soil. And most of that respiration is done by decomposer organisms, and most of those decomposer organisms, in terms of total biomass, are bacteria. That produces carbon dioxide, and eventually that carbon dioxide will be released back to the atmosphere as it diffuses out of soil. Are we done yet? Okay, what else do we need to add? So some of this just never leaves soil, and it's just pent up in what we call soil carbon. And over time, that can be incorporated into bedrock, and then that bedrock can ultimately be turned into things like fossil fuels over long periods of time. These organic matter deposits that are embedded in bedrock. What else do we need? Yeah. Well, oxygen is not part of the carbon cycle, unless you're talking about the oxygen that is bound to carbon. And why do we not study the oxygen cycle? No, it's plenty cool. We need it to survive. But why do we not study it as a nutrient cycle? So it's often bonded to one of the other elements. Who can tell me the composition of the atmosphere in terms of the things floating around the atmosphere, the chemical compounds floating around in the atmosphere? CO2, nitrogen, what? Oxygen. You guys know what the percentage of the air that is nitrogen? Can somebody give me something firm? 70. It's higher than that.
75%.
Can you guys just look it up on the internet? It's the first time I've ever said, just look something up on the internet. I do never say that. Because I want you to go, huh? What? 78%. Yep. What about oxygen? What about oxygen? Just look up atmospheric composition at 21%. So that's 99% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen and oxygen. What is carbon dioxide? Yeah, the number I carry around in my head is 0.0034. Oh, but it's going up. Damn, I hate time. Time messing with me. I have to learn new numbers. So 0.004 of 1% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. Why do we not talk about oxygen when we talk about nutrient cycling? There's tons of it. Tons of oxygen going around. What is there not much of? There's not a lot of carbon. Not a lot of carbon dioxide. So Dr. Judd told you something, and I almost chimed in. He talked about carbon dioxide as not being something that limits the rate of photosynthesis. I do remember you saying this, right?
Under certain conditions.
Okay. So when I was what's that?
Go ahead. I can't remember where you're going.
Yeah. Okay. Now that you know, now that he knows where I'm going, he's agreeing to this. So carbon dioxide, when I was your age, we taught that carbon dioxide is not in such low amounts in the atmosphere that it limits the growth of plants. We just taught that, and that was the gospel. That was it. That was what was known. Now actually we know that if we set up carbon dioxide emitters out in a field, when you give plants more carbon dioxide, they will oftentimes grow more. They will do more photosynthesis. There are a set of experiments around the world called FACE experiments. This stands for Free Air Carbon Dioxide Enhancement Experiments. In some cases, they have these in prairies. There's CO2 supplies that are hooked up to pipes. They run the pipes down through the ground, and then these little towers, these little PVC towers come up out of the ground. They have holes in them, and they basically pump carbon dioxide into these little localized areas of plants. And when you look at those areas of plants, those plants grow faster than places that have all the piping and everything, but they're not pumping in any carbon dioxide. In Oregon, there's even one of these that is done at a forest scale. So the pipes that come out of the ground are really huge and they are really tall, and they're pumping CO2 to trees, and they also find that trees grow faster when you give them supplemental carbon dioxide. So one of the reasons that we studied carbon cycling is because it's not terribly common, and it can limit the growth of plants. And the other reason we study carbon dioxide, which is a kind of practical reason, and it's a reason in the news right now, is what? Okay, it's a greenhouse gas. It's one of the gases that causes global warming. So the two main transformations that we have for the carbon cycle are photosynthesis, which is the top equation, and cellular respiration, which is the bottom equation. And this is what the carbon cycle looks like. And so we've drawn what everything is over there on the board, but here what we've done is we've now put numbers on the sizes of these fluxes. So up in the atmosphere, this is 760 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 7, 6, 0 grams of carbon. So that's how much carbon is floating around in the atmosphere. It's also in common parlance known as a shit ton of carbon. Of that carbon, 120 of that carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and incorporated into plant biomass every year. So of this 100 of the 760, we take out 120, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 grams of carbon per year. And so I'm just going to stop writing zeros because it's stupid and just say 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year. So 120 comes into plants. Plant shoots above ground biomass and plant roots below ground biomass. It was carbon dioxide up here, it's glucose here. Now, some of that is assimilated by animals, but ultimately both plants and animals die. Plants and animals are using this carbon that is captured by plants. But plants not only do photosynthesis, they also do cellular respiration. When a bison eats some grass, it also breaks down that glucose and does cellular respiration. So 60 times 10 times 60 times 10 to the 15th grams is returned back to the atmosphere. So 120 comes out of the atmosphere, 60 goes back just from plants and animals doing their normal day-to-day things. You breathe in, you breathe out. Part of what you're breathing out is carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide that is built up in your bloodstream because you've been sitting here learning evolutionary ecology, burning a lot of glucose in your brain, and you're spewing out that carbon dioxide. Plants and animals do that to the tune of 60 times 10 to the 15th grams per year. When these plants and animals die, they go into the dead organic matter pool, which is just glucose. But then that glucose gets decomposed, gets used by those decomposer organisms, most of whom are bacteria. And those bacteria break that down to the tune of about 60 times 10 to the 15th grams per year. But 5 of that gets stored as soil carbon, stays in the soil. But the other 55 of that gets ejected back into the atmosphere through this process that we refer to as soil respiration, the amount of carbon dioxide that is being metabolized by bacteria and fungi and everything in the soil, and then gets kicked back to the atmosphere rather than being stored down in the soil. So if you do the simple math of this, plants take 120 times 10 to the 15th grams per year out of the atmosphere. So that's removing carbon in the form of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But then it puts back 60 times 10 to the 15th in the form of respiration. Then those plants and animals that are on the surface and near the surface of the soil, they die, their bodies get into the soil, and the decomposers decompose them, but the other 60 of this 120 that came into the plants is left in the bodies of all those plants and animals, and so 60 of that goes to decomposition. But of this 60, 5 of it gets stored as soil carbon, which means that 55 of it goes back to the atmosphere. So, according to this way of looking at this cycle, 120 times 10 to the 15 grams are removed every year, and 115 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon is returned to the atmosphere, so that there's 5 times 10 to the 15 grams of storage. So we would think of this normally as a nutrient cycle that stores nutrients in a pool, and the pool that it stores nutrients in is soil carbon. So it's down in the soil. If this is the way the carbon cycle works, why are climate scientists all up in arms about carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere? We're going to stop with that. Think about that question between now and Friday, and we'll start here on Wednesday. Getting ahead of myself. We'll start with that question on Wednesday. Dr. Judd has tests. I have literature summaries. Oh, that's Dr. Judd's.